going now to introduce two amazing partners in this effort who will be our main presenters for this evening. So first, Hillary is telling me that we just updated the chat permissions so folks can introduce themselves. So sorry about that, and please introduce yourself if you can in the chat. So first we're going to hear from Ilana Solomon, who is here representing Trade Justice. Welcome, Ilana. Ilana has worked at the intersection of trade and climate for many, many years, shedding light on the environmental threats posed by our global trading system. She was previously the director of the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program and was also the federal campaigns director at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's one of the world's leading experts on trade and climate. Welcome, Ilana. Once Ilana has explained the core details of this issue to us, we'll then hear from Clayton Tucker on some concrete action steps we can all take in support of a climate peace clause. Clayton is on the staff of Trade Justice and previously was the lead organizer for our revolution in Texas. Welcome, Clayton. After both have spoken, we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. You don't have to wait until the end, though, to ask questions. You can use the Q&A button on your screen to type in your question or a brief comment at any time. And I encourage you to please do that. So please, Ilana and Clayton, thank you both for being with us. Ilana, please take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. Love seeing folks introducing themselves on the chat, see folks that have fought previous trade agreements, see old friends from across the country. And I'm just so pleased that you all decided to spend your Wednesday, it is evening, with us. So again, I'm Ilana Solomon. I'm here with the Trade Justice Education Fund, and today we'll be talking about how trade rules are currently undermining climate action, how a climate peace clause, which is essentially a commitment from governments to refrain from using trade rules to challenge other countries' climate policies, would help safeguard climate measures from trade attacks. Let's go to the next slide. And in order to set up the conversation and just do some level setting, I want to start by just giving a little bit of history of free trade in order to give a sense of how we got to the place where we are today with trade rules undermining climate action. And the key points I want to emphasize in this slightly text-heavy slide, I apologize, is that free trade, so-called free trade, evolved from a system in the late 1940s when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, was established. That was primarily about removing the tariffs or the taxes, import taxes, so that products could flow more freely and more cheaply. It evolved from that, right, into the 1940s and 50s into a system in the 1980s and 1990s, the decade in which both the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed and the World Trade Organization, or WTO, was established. That was really not anymore about removing those tariffs. Those were already decreased so heavily, but it was about removing standards and safeguards and regulations like bans on toxic chemicals, like permitting requirements for oil and gas, all so that multinational corporations, surprise, surprise, could trade more, could invest more, and at the end of the day, earn more profits regardless of the impacts to human health and the environment. So now we're in a position, because negotiations at the WTO have functionally stalled, that there have been an increasing number of what's called bilateral free trade agreements between two countries or multilateral free trade agreements between many countries, smaller sets of countries. And these agreements typically go even beyond the commitments made in the World Trade Organization. They're even more restrictive and allow for even less government intervention. And that is hugely problematic because government intervention is actually exactly what we need in order to combat the climate crisis. So to the next slide. So we've done a little bit of level setting on trade, a very brief history. Let's do a little bit of level setting on climate. As folks may well know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the leading scientific body on climate change. And it has stated that allowing the planet to warm more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels risks, quote, crisis after crisis for vulnerable people and societies, and irreversible loss of the most fragile ecosystems. So recognizing that those catastrophic implications of inaction, in 2015, 196 countries adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty that sets a goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5. And to meet that goal, the world has until 2030, the IPCC says, less than a decade to cut climate pollution by about half. And yet, unfortunately, tragically, the global community is not on track to meet that goal. And closing that gap between where emissions need to be and where we are now will require governments, particularly rich governments, developed country governments that have done the most to create the climate crisis, to dramatically ratchet up their climate ambition to reach the goals that we need to. And ratcheting up climate ambition will again require that strong government intervention that our trade rules do not allow for. That's bold clean energy subsidies. That's stronger regulation of pollution. Could be bans on fossil fuel production. It could be incentives to create new green jobs and more. And yet, once again, just these trade rules written well before governments had committed to tackle climate change are increasingly now being used to directly challenge and indirectly discourage governments' climate and renewable energy policies. Go to the next slide. So the threats of trade rules being used to challenge or weaken climate policies is not hypothetical. And in fact, there is an example that is playing out right now in the United States with the recently passed US Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, as I will refer to it. The IRA was passed by the US Congress and signed into law in 2022. It is imperfect. It is not far enough, but it is, I would say, the most ambitious climate legislation passed in the United States and is a critical step towards a clean energy economy in the United States. It includes about $370 billion in federal climate investments. Government and independent experts show that the IRA will help cut climate pollution by approximately 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. It's not all we need, but again, it's a really important step forward. And a critical component of the IRA are tax credits, which encourage domestic production of electric vehicles and batteries, critical provisions which help boost green jobs at home. This, I believe, Trade Justice believes, is the type of green jobs and climate program that should be strengthened and expanded in the United States. And it should be strengthened and expanded and brought in other countries as well, not just the United States, but all countries should have the ability to foster and grow their clean energy economy and reap the benefits of the clean energy economy. But instead of emulating or doing a similar industrial policy in their countries, many countries have taken instead to threatening the United States with trade cases. So we've seen, for example, the European Union, EU member countries, South Korea, and others claiming that the IRA breaks trade rules and are threatening to launch trade cases against the United States. And unfortunately, this is just the latest in a string of attacks on climate policies. You can go to the next slide. So just within the last decade, for example, Japan and the EU have successfully challenged Ontario, Canada's program to support renewable energy. The US has successfully challenged India's national solar program that incentivized local solar production and manufacturing. India responded by successfully challenging renewable energy programs in 8 US states that use these buy local rules as well. Indonesia is challenging EU's restrictions on palm oil-based biofuels. Malaysia has brought a similar case against the EU, France, Lithuania, claiming that the EU renewable energy target violates the WTO. Next slide. So in the context of a climate emergency, where countries must have every tool in the toolbox to quickly and dramatically ramp up climate action, I would argue it is madness to have governments using trade rules to threaten climate policies. These trade challenges pose direct threats to climate policies when governments need to be ramping up climate action. They add legal uncertainty and delay at a moment when delayed action poses catastrophic and shared global risks. And they pose what's called a chilling effect. And that means that the mere threat of a timely and costly trade case and trade litigation may deter governments, especially governments with lower resources, from adopting climate measures or move climate policies, or move climate policymakers to shape policies in a way that they think will conform to trade rules rather than what will be best for our climate. So this idea of a peace clause that trade justice has been working with many partners to push governments to adopt is, again, a commitment from governments to acknowledge that just because these rules, these old, outdated rules exist, doesn't actually mean governments have to use them. And governments can commit to refrain from using dispute settlement mechanisms, these rules and trade agreements that allow a government to challenge another government's climate policies. Adopting a peace clause would help the US and, very importantly, other governments safeguard existing climate mitigation policies and transition measures by protecting them from trade challenges. It would create space for governments to adopt the bolder policies that science and justice demand. And it would also incentivize and offer countries time to work together to resolve the underlying tensions in trade and climate policy. We actually need to fundamentally change the rules, but that will take time, and we don't have time in the climate crisis. So we need an immediate ceasefire, an immediate moratorium, and then we also need to work on changing the rules. So this is a relatively easy, a relatively straightforward step that the US and other governments can take right now to make a really meaningful impact. So with that, we're going to dig into just a little bit more detail on what a climate peace clause could entail. And let's go to the next slide. So just to talk about scope, the climate peace clause, as we have proposed it, as we envision it at Trade Justice and with our partners, would protect essentially any measure whose objective is to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and or support the transition to a clean energy economy, whether directly or indirectly. We didn't list a set of policies that the peace clause would protect because we want to be expansive and we might not even know all the policies that governments might want to use in the future, but it's just an illustrative list of the types of policies that climate peace clause would protect. It might include rejections of fossil fuel permits or development, removal of fossil fuel subsidies, more green energy subsidies, government procurement policies that prioritize green building materials, for example, local content preferences that help ramp up the production and distribution of renewable energy and clean energy goods. And again, policies that create or protect green jobs and facilitate the transition to a clean energy economy. Go to the next slide. In terms of duration. We've thought about different ways of how to structure the peace clause. In our proposal, we have suggested that it could last for a fixed term of 10 years, but it would renew automatically until countries have addressed the underlying tensions between trade and climate policy. So this ensures protection for governments' climate policies over the next decade, the critical decade on climate change. But it also provides some time and incentive again for countries to work together to resolve some of those underlying tensions between trade law and the imperative for climate action. Go to the next slide. I'll also say there's far more details about our proposal for a climate peace clause. I'm not going to go into all the details now, but we can certainly make sure that everyone has our discussion paper, which lays out other elements of how it could work, and we could talk about more in our discussion. But before we get into our take actions, I'll just say a little bit about where a climate peace clause and how a climate peace clause could be established. And the short answer is we want it established in lots of places, and we certainly don't want to wait for WTO to have to agree upon it. So we are calling for a peace clause to be established between coalitions of the willing. That could be through joint declarations, let's say, between the US and the European Union that now have this sort of ongoing tension building. It could be in places like the group of 7 developed countries, the G7, and their declaration commit to a climate peace clause to not challenge each other. And also potentially not challenge developing countries' climate policies. And it could be within the texts of pending what we call bilateral and regional trade frameworks, which I'll say a little bit about now in the next slide. So there are a number of initiatives right now that the administration is negotiating that could include a climate peace clause, and that we are advocating, Trade Justice and our partners, to include a climate peace clause. Again, the US and the EU are currently negotiating a framework called the Trade and Technology Council, or the TTC. We have been advocating that they should include a climate peace clause in that framework. The US is also negotiating a framework called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, with 13 other countries. We are advocating, again, that the peace clause should be included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We believe a peace clause, again, should be included in the G7, at the G20, and we're taking a little bit of a throw the spaghetti at the wall approach and try to get it in as many places and see what sticks. But we need your help to make this happen. We have potentially limited time, even with a second term of President Biden in office. And we have been hearing increased calls for the peace clause, including, as I saw in the introductions from some of you on the line today. But we are really looking to expand the chorus of folks that are talking about the incredible disconnect of our current trade policy and the imperative to take action on climate change. And really need to change the paradigm so that our climate imperative and taking action on climate change takes precedent over the dogmatic approach to free trade. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Clayton, who is going to talk about a few ways to take action.
Howdy, y'all. So yeah, my name is Clayton Tucker. I'm with the Trade Justice Education Fund, and thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out of your evenings to be with us. And we really are going to need you to join us and help us really push this message forward. So we have a couple things, and we'll be following up with everyone who RSVP'd and joined us today individually to kind of see what make an action plan to help us out the most. So if you're in a league of an organization, we have a letter that we're collecting for organizations, particularly state and local ones. This letter, we just want to show that a lot of organizations all around the United States support a climate peace clause and really start building that grassroots support. But we also want to make sure that individuals can join in as well. So we'll have a petition that one of my coworkers and colleagues, Hillary, will be posting. So if you could, please sign that petition and share that petition. It's for anyone and everyone. So again, just really sign that and share that, really spread that around. If you can, post it on social media. we'll be kind of following up with each of y'all to kind of develop what's the best game plan, best action plan, so we can really build this really important movement and really share all this really great information that Ilana has been sharing. So again, that link should be in the chat, and we will be sending y'all follow-up emails that will have a whole bunch of other things. And with that, I will pass it back.
Thank you both. This is really, really, really interesting to me. I mean, it's something that it's something that you don't hear every day in the news, that it's so critical and so important and can make such a big difference. So we now have a little bit of time for some questions. And so please let me just remind everyone that if you have a question or brief comment, please type it now using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And so I'm going to start and go ahead and read some of those questions, but while I'm reading them, before I read them, actually, I'm going to start with the first one. I get asked to sign petitions all the time. Does it really make a difference?
Clayton, you want to jump in on that one? I'm happy to reinforce.
Sure. So yes, it does make a difference, because one of the great ways it helps in two fronts. First, it shows the widespread support. So it shows that individuals know what a climate peace clause is, that they are willing to, if you're willing to sign it, that's an important step, particularly in a democracy. So it helps spread awareness as well. So if you share it, for instance, on your social media or with your friends or family or colleagues, then that's a way for them to learn about it. I mean, it's really that kind of grassroots action. So long as we really spread it out and make sure a lot of people see it and a lot of people sign it, that could really build that grassroots base that we need, along with everything else that we need to really push a climate peace clause through.
Okay.
I would just add to that, if I can. Totally agree with Clayton. It does make a difference, especially because we are going to use this petition. If you sign this petition, we already have delivery plans where we are going to make sure our policymakers, and we are partnering with other organizations, not just in the United States, to make sure their policymakers hear that there is demand for these policies. So this petition does not just sit in our computers. We will use it, we will organize it, we will make sure that everyone who has signed it will reach the policymakers for whom it is intended.
Thank you. Annie Phillips is asking, where is the sign-on letter for organizations? Is it the same?
No, that one will be different. I will follow up with you tomorrow morning. So everyone who signed on, I will be sending that link out tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Clayton. So Sheldon is asking, can we be pushing our congressional representatives on the peace clause, given that they don't seem to be involved in IPEF and maybe other pending deals? Can they help much?
Yeah, Sheldon, long time friend in the trade movement. I'm so glad you're on tonight. Yeah, a few responses to that, and I see a few questions from you. First of all, yes, we should be, absolutely, you should be, and I will be too, but I live in DC, so it's harder without representation. But please be talking to your member of Congress and calling for a peace clause. The more that members of Congress put pressure on the administration, that will be an enormous help. I also see the question from Sheldon, what trade agreement would the EU use against the US? And it's the WTO. The EU has threatened to bring a case against, essentially threatened to bring a case under the World Trade Organization against the United States. Some countries like South Korea, who have a free trade agreement with the US, have threatened to bring a trade case both under the free trade agreement and the World Trade Organization. And to the question, Mark, I'm sorry, I'm reading a few others from Sheldon, of peace clause likely be included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I think the answer is not, unless we all really call for it, right? It is very hard to know what the US trade representative, the part of the US government that negotiates free trade agreement, it's very hard to know where they're at. It is not a transparent set of negotiations, unfortunately. So it is really up to us to make our voices heard, to not take anything for granted. And yes, to be engaging with our members of Congress and also calling on them to be asking for a peace clause to be included in these trade frameworks and other spaces, like I mentioned, the G7 coming up.
Thank you. There's a question from an anonymous participant, and it says, objectively, what is the standard that distinguishes between climate change rules and protectionism?
Oh, such an interesting question. Look, I think this concept of protectionism has all of a sudden become, the word protectionist has become this very negative word in today's sort of society and discourse. And protectionism, what protectionist policies really are, so-called protectionist, is a set of policies that developed countries in particular have been using for centuries to develop their industries. That could be through tariffs, it could be through subsidies, it could be through other policies. Tragically, when developing countries have tried to use those same policies, developed countries have made it very hard. But there's actually nothing inherently wrong with a country trying to protect an industry and foster an industry. It is just against the dogma of free trade that, since I was saying the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, have really imposed. But protectionism isn't necessarily a bad thing. It has just been today it has very negative connotations, but I would just say that there are appropriate ways to develop and use, and it has been used for history, and particularly developing countries, I would argue, who have not benefited from the same use of policies as developed countries have, should have actually every right to be able to grow and foster their industries.
Thank you. Another one. Could a climate peace clause be enacted as an act of Congress that specifically override all treaties in conflict with it?
Oh gosh, can you state that one again?
Could a climate peace clause be enacted as an act of Congress that specifically overrides all treaties in conflict with it?
Yeah. So the way we've been thinking about the climate peace clause, and really interesting to think about other ways to do it, is that it protects policies from this moment on. It is not actually something, as we envision it, that would need to be approved by Congress, because it doesn't change US law. It simply urges the US to use restraint in enforcing the existing laws that exist. We don't actually think the trade policies are helpful. We don't actually need to use them. There are other ways that one could design it that might use congressional action, but especially with the expediency that we need to deal with the climate crisis, we have been thinking about this as a tool that the executive would use to negotiate with other countries.
Thank you. So bring your questions, please, because we're almost done with them. So if I understand correctly, many trade agreements are between the United States and private entity, between the states, I'm sorry, and private entities. This peace clause would not be binding on private entities, yet a large portion of legal actions are launched by these private entities. As such, threats to climate protective legislation still exist. What are some ideas you have that might contribute to curbing these lawsuits by private entities?
Yes, you are 100% correct. There is another major problem out there, and it is rules that you are referring to called the investor state dispute settlement system. And these are rules in trade agreements that empower foreign corporations to directly sue governments in private trade tribunals over laws and policies that private entity alleges has infringed on its profits. Hugely problematic. It was included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that many of us fought against, and many prior trade agreements. And thanks to decades of incredibly hard work of community members likely like you and many others in the United States and in other countries, we have made investor-state dispute settlement, that system of corporate rights, essentially politically untenable for inclusion in any US free trade agreements. President Biden opposes investor-state dispute settlement. Even Donald Trump, for other reasons, opposed investor-state dispute settlement. So now the really hard part is removing investor-state dispute settlements that exists in all of the trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties that do exist. So our peace clause, the peace clause, is a bit distinct, but is interwoven. So we are #1 calling, separate from the peace clause, for the elimination, the end of all of investor-state dispute settlement, and it should be removed from all existing agreements, and it should never be agreed to again. In addition, we have this problem that we are talking about tonight of governments challenging government climate policies. That also needs to be addressed through a peace clause. And one part of the peace clause that I didn't mention tonight, but it is very important, and in the discussion paper that I mentioned, is that in the peace clause, government should also commit to refuse to enter any new trade agreement that includes investor-state dispute settlement, and government should commit to terminate investor-state dispute settlement provisions in existing free trade agreements. So there are two critical issues. We've just made more progress in the US on the investor-state, these corporate rights. But thank you for bringing that great question.
So, Ilana, I can see why the US would want to stop Europe from attacking the climate measures in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. But why would European countries go for a peace clause?
Yeah, good question. This was one of the challenges when we first started seeing the EU and EU countries challenging the US IRA, is that, the response we really wanted was the race to the top. We do think the US has done an important step in passing the IRA, and we absolutely do not think that the United States should be the only country to pass IRA-like legislation. Now Europe is actually, in some countries in Europe and the EU, are starting to think about what, buy European, what IRA-like legislation could look like in the EU, and a peace clause could protect that. The EU has also taken bolder steps on climate change in many ways, with many policies, than the US has, and a peace clause could protect that as well. And because the EU supposedly cares, about showing leadership on climate change, and this is a big way to show that it shows leadership on climate change. If I may, I also think I saw another question about developing countries, and this is another really important dynamic, is why a developing country might want to enter into a climate peace clause. The first thing I'd say is that absolutely no questions, developed countries are the largest historic emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. They should be the first ones to commit to a climate peace clause. That's one of the reasons why inserting a peace clause in the US-EU Trade and Technology Council or the G7 is one of the first places we would start. That being said, developing countries also need space to adopt bold climate policies, and developing countries are typically the ones that are on the worst receiving end of WTO and other trade challenges. So they have a lot also to gain from having developed countries committing to not challenge their climate policies. But because of the power inequity, we have stated in our discussion paper that should a developed country enter into a peace clause arrangement with a developing country, that peace clause should also include commitments from the developed country to provide financial support, technical assistance, transfer of green technology to that developing country, as that developing country is also giving up a bit. It's giving up the right to challenge some developed country policies. It is gaining autonomy, and with finance and technology, would be gaining more access to resources and technology as well. So sorry, that was a long answer, but wanted to talk about both of those things.
Really interesting. Yeah. So Sheldon says, I am so concerned that Congress is not, as of now, being asked to vote on IPEF and other deals. It seems outrageous and actually unconstitutional. How much hope is there that Biden will reverse course on this?
Yeah, I truly don't know the answer, Selden. So one of the things that the Biden administration has done to depart from past administrations, definitely the Trump administrations, but past Democratic administrations as well, is that he's not including what's called market access provisions in these frameworks, right? They're called frameworks now, they're not trade agreements. And in the administration's mind, this distinguishes it from something that would have to go to Congress. So there's a big fight brewing now between Congress, who wants more say over and constitutional authority, exercise their constitutional authority over trade agreements, and the executive branch, which argues that it has the authority to negotiate these agreements. I think there's absolutely right to be concern over congressional authority over massive trade frameworks, agreements, whatever you call them. They're still impactful, they're still binding rules. How this is going to play out, I truly don't know.
Interesting. Martha is asking us, why is it called a peace clause? Good question.
Very good question. So we did not make this up, actually. It is actually like a term of art in the World Trade Organization, actually. And there was a past peace clause that was different from this. It was around food security measures and allowing developing countries to keep food stocks that are larger than they otherwise would have. India in particular has invoked it several times, but it is called a peace clause. But it's essentially this idea of we're not taking aim at each other anymore, right? We are calling it truce. We are calling it peace. The peace clause is the idea of not using the trade rules to challenge and attack other countries' policies.
Thank you, Lana. I don't think we have any more questions. I would want to ask, how does a climate peace clause relate to the fight against the investor state dispute settlement system? Like, for example, with the Keystone XL case here in the US?
Yeah, great question. So we've spoken a little bit about this, but just to reinforce again, we in the United States have, between massive coalitions of labor unions and environmental organizations and faith-based and consumer rights and many others, have done a pretty incredible job of campaigning against investor state dispute settlement. Let me also say that partners in other countries have also done an incredible job and made incredible gains through various political context. In the United States, we have this situation in which Biden has said he will not agree to more investor state dispute settlement, and Donald Trump, again, also had not. So they're sort of on parallel but interwoven tracks where we continue to say no, absolutely no, to corporate rights and corporations being given essentially the status of a nation state, allowing it to challenge climate and other policies in private trade tribunals. And we reinforce this by having and suggesting a commitment in the peace clause to say that governments refuse to enter into new trade and investment agreements with investor state dispute settlement, and to go even further to say governments commit to terminate investor state dispute settlement provisions in existing ones. So these are two different major threats: investor state cases, corporations challenging government policies, and state to state cases, governments challenging government policies, and both need to be addressed. We're just a little further along already on the investor state.
Thank you. Selden is asking, is Trade Justice Educational Fund speaking out on the issue of Congress not being given a vote on these frameworks? Or perhaps you have a reason for just letting Congress and the president fight this out?
Excellent question. My work with trade justice has been very specific to the peace clause, so we are going to get back to votes on any opportunities we have, unless anyone else on the call wants to speak to this, about what trade justice and partners are doing to ensure that Congress has a say in trade frameworks.
Thank you very much, Ilana. If there are no more questions, I see a hand from Gina. Gina, please let us know if you want to say something or if we have already touched on your question. But if not, we're gonna leave it here. Oh, okay, Gina says already answered, but there's another question from David. It says, is there any coordination or preparation for APEC this year, APEC?
Yeah, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So the US is hosting this APEC forum and this leaders summit in November. And sorry for all the acronyms, but the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that we discussed, one of these trade frameworks, is going to be one of the main outcomes, according to governments, of this APEC summit. So there's going to be ministerial meetings in May in Detroit, in August in Seattle, and there will certainly be rallies and actions, and all of us, not just on the peace clause, but demanding the broad set of provisions protecting labor and consumer rights and public health and climate change in the agreement. So that is something to look out for. We will be sending more opportunities on how to get involved in demanding that the frameworks being negotiated now are a dramatic departure from the frameworks of the past.
Thank you. I don't think we don't have any more questions. So
well, that was tough. You guys are good.
thank you for all those questions. It was really, really, really educational. And this is a really important issue. And thank you for your commitment. And we'll be following up with you all on next steps. And this is about action. This is about you. This is about each of us. And we'll be in contact. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. This conversation has been recorded. Hopefully you can also use it to share with others. We'll be sending that out, and thank you all.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you all.